Every woman I have worked with who has come through menopause says the exact same thing. They say, I'm more content now than I was at age 35. I have more clarity about what matters, more emotional steadiness, more confidence in my own judgment. And every single one of them is surprised by it because nothing they have ever heard about menopause prepared them for this reality. That menopause can actually be the beginning of the greatest chapter of their lives. Most women are told that menopause is something to survive, something to push through, medicate through, or just endure. And that precondition is making most women leave an insane amount of potential on the table. So today, I'm going to show you exactly why menopause can genuinely be the best period of your life and what actually makes that possible. Before I get into the specifics, there is one thing I need you to understand first. The reason most women expect the worst going into menopause is that everything they have ever heard about it tells the same story. Your brain slows down, you lose sharpness, things get harder, and that's just what happens. And part of the story is accurate. There is a type of thinking that shifts as we get older, the fast reactive kind, the kind that helps you learn new things quickly or think on your feet in a situation you have never been before. You might notice that some things take a little more effort than they used to. That's real, but that is genuinely only one side of it. What that story never mentions is that while one type of thinking is shifting, another type is coming into its own. One that's been building the entire time, that nobody can hand you, that only comes from decades of actually living and doing things and being in the room. And it's the type that in my experience turned out to be considerably more useful at this stage of life than the one that's changing. The women I have worked with who understood this going in went through the transition differently, not without difficulty, but with a sense of what was actually on the other side. And they came out of it operating at a level that genuinely surprised them. That's what this video is about. So the first thing that changes, and this is the one that catches most women off guard when I describe it, is that all the experience you have accumulated starts to work for you in a way it couldn't before. Psychologists draw a distinction between two types of intelligence. One is the fast kind, the kind that helps you pick things up quickly, react well in new situations, and process things on the fly. The other is the deep kind. The kind that's built from years of actually doing things, making mistakes, watching how people behave, recognizing patterns across hundreds of different situations. It's what lets you walk into a room and immediately understand what's going on between people, or know within 30 seconds what someone actually needs from a conversation before they have said it. In your 20s and 30s, you have both of those available to you, but you are leaning heavily on the fast kind because you are still building the deep kind. You don't have 25 years of patterns to draw on yet. By your 40s and 50s, you do. And what happens during this transition is that your brain starts to organize all of that, all of those years into something you can actually access and use quickly. I spoke with a woman after an event a few years ago. She was in her early 50s. She had recently had a really hard conversation with her daughter. The kind where you can tell something is clearly wrong. But she's not saying it directly. She said, Mari, I knew exactly what was happening. I could see the logic underneath what she was saying. I could tell where she was actually stuck and why. I knew what she needed from me before she had finished the first sentence. Then she paused and said, a few years ago, I would have just reacted. I would have given advice that wasn't actually what she needed, but this time I could just see it. What she was describing is something psychologists call crystallized intelligence, and it doesn't peak in your 20s. It builds your entire life. For many women, it really comes into its own in their 40s and early 50s. You have spent decades in the room. You have had thousands of conversations. You have watched how situations play out, how people behave when they are scared or under pressure, or when they are not saying what they mean. All of that experience has been accumulating. And now it starts to click together in a way that makes you significantly more capable than you were 10 years ago, even in the moments when you feel less sharp. If you work with people in any capacity, this is when your judgment becomes the thing others start to quietly rely on. It doesn't announce itself loudly, but once you know it's there, you will start to recognize it. The second thing that changes is something I hear women describe consistently once they are on the other side of this transition. And they almost always say it the same way. They say, I just don't get pulled, of course, the way I used to. A lot of women go into this worried they will become more emotional, more reactive. And in perimenopause, that worry often feels completely justified because the hormonal swings can genuinely make things harder to manage during that season, unless you engineer it well. But once a solid system is in place, most women find a baseline they have never had before. A kind of steadiness that isn't about controlling anything or suppressing anything. Is just there. The best way I found to explain it is this. Imagine you have spent years sailing on the ocean's surface. The wind changes constantly. Swells come out of nowhere. You have become a skilled sailor over time. You have learned to adjust to read the water, to keep yourself from being knocked too far off course. Now imagine you drop an anchor all the way down to where the current runs steady, where the surface can't reach you. The waves are still there. The weather still changes, but you are no longer being carried by it. That's what women describe. Not that everything around them has calmed down, but they have stopped being at the mercy of it. And from that place, something shifts in how they spend their energy. When you are not pouring so much of it into managing your own reactions, it goes somewhere else. Women talk about finally having difficult conversation they had been putting off for years and actually being able to say what they mean without it going sideways. They talk about feeling less pulled towards relationships that drain them and more drawn to the ones that genuinely matter. They talk about caring less about whether everyone approves of them, and usually, to their surprise, finding that people respond better to the more direct version of them anyway. It's not a personality change. It's more like the clearest version of who you already are finally has room to come through. The third principle is the one I think matters most. I want to tell you about a woman I worked with. I will call her Sarah. Sarah was going through one of the hardest periods of her career. Her company was restructuring, and she was in the room where the decisions were being made about who was going to lose their jobs. What I remember the most is what wasn't in the room with her. No panic, no spiral of worst case scenarios. She was clearly feeling the weight of it, but she was steady underneath it. She was carrying it rather than being crushed by it. The next day, she stood up in that meeting. She was the only woman there, and instead of staying quiet or getting swept up in the direction the room was already going, she laid out a different path. She had thought through scenarios where people could be retrained and moved into areas of the business that were growing. She made the case clearly and specifically. She told me afterwards, Marie, a few years ago, I would never have done that. Not because I didn't have the idea, but because I would have been too worried about getting it wrong, too concerned about the politics of it. That is what I mean by the value-led impact. And this is genuinely the part of this transition that almost nobody talks about. When the dust settles after all the things that used to pull at you from every direction start to quiet down, something comes into focus that was probably always there but kept getting pushed aside. What you actually care about, who you want to be when something important is at stake. For many women, that clarity comes into full focus for the first time right around here. Not because they have turned into someone new, but because they have stopped being quite so afraid of themselves. You can hear it when a friend tells you that something you said was exactly what she needed. This transition when you actually go through it well, doesn't just change your biology, it changes what you are willing to do with your life. Everything I have described so far is what's available on the other side of this transition. But in the middle of it, something else is going on that can genuinely shake you. During perimenopause especially, a lot of women start to notice that some of the things they have always been able to count on don't feel as reliable as they used to. Their focus, their memory, the ability to stay composed in a stressful situation, the ability to make a decision quickly and just trust it. And the hard part isn't any single bad moment. The hard part is not knowing which version of yourself you will have access to on a given day. Some days, everything works exactly as it always has. On other days, the same level of clarity takes twice the effort to reach, and you can't quite get there. And if you are not careful, it starts to tell you a story about yourself that isn't actually true. Your brain is going through a real reorganization. The hormonal signals it's been running on for decades are changing, and during that period, things will feel less stable than usual. That is real, and it is hard, and it makes complete sense that it's disorienting. But it can be solved and supported, and understanding that while you are in it, rather than concluding that you are in permanent decline, is one of the most important things you can do for yourself during this time of transition. Think about what this phase actually looks like in practice. For many women, the kids who consumed the much of their time and energy for so many years are grown or nearly grown. The things you have spent decades building, your career, your relationship, your sense of who you are, those are solid now. You know yourself in a way you genuinely didn't at 32. And for the first time in a long time, the attention and energy you have had pulled in 10 directions at once start to free up. That is an extraordinary thing to have available, especially now. It is what I call the beginning of the golden decade. Not because life becomes easy or uncomplicated, but because for the first time you can engineer the conditions that allow you to do the things that matter most to you. Whether you experience that comes down to one thing: whether you understand this transition well enough to go through it on purpose, or whether you spend it fighting something that was actually working in your favor. That's why I make these videos. So what I hope you are taking from this is simple. Menopause is not the beginning of the end. For the women who understand what's happening, how to support the process, and their options to engineer a solid foundation is the beginning of something they didn't see coming. And whether you land on the right side of this largely depends on how well you understand what's going on with your body and brain during the transition, specifically with your sex hormones. And most women have this part completely backwards. So click here to watch the next video where I break down exactly what's happening with your estrogen during this phase and why getting that right changes the whole experience. See you there.